the micro perspective, which we didn't have before. So the floor is open now for questions, comments. Andy would like to start.
Andy Moravchuk from Princeton. I found it a very interesting panel. I had two rather specific questions. For Flavia Jorge, I'm wondering how you conclude that executives gain power, really, and what that means. So it could mean two things. One is that they gain discretion somehow over an issue, or, given the way you set it up, that somehow people or civil society or somebody's losing power. But I don't see how either of those is really true given your cases, because you pick a kind of atypical situation in the EU, which is a situation in which the country in question is completely a norm taker, right? They're just implementing a set of norms which don't even come from the EU, they actually come from international law, right? But a typical EU issue is an issue where the executive is representing civil society in a negotiation about what the norm is going to be. And in that situation, first of all, the executive is acting in fiduciary responsibility for people, and secondly, the norm is in play, right? So you don't know what it's going to be, and therefore the executive has some discretion, and so power means something. In this case, power doesn't really mean something, and so it's obvious that the country is not going to have any power at all, so there's no power to distribute in a sense. So I don't really understand what it means to say that the executive does or doesn't have power in that case. For Antonietta Dimitrova, so as I understand your hypothesis that you're working on, it's that there's a kind of process in which countries go through a state of flux, and in that state of flux they could be open to external pressure through conditionality. So this seems to imply that any state in such a state of flux could be influenced by the EU to become anything. And that seems kind of implausible. So it makes one think that there must be structural constraints on the ability to get states to do this. And so I'm wondering how you would distinguish this from a cruder view that there's some countries by virtue of economic structure or geography or ethnic diversity or something else that are less suited to be members of the European Union. So there's some more intrinsic difference between the Czech Republic and Macedonia or the Ukraine in regard to how quickly or perhaps at all, or Turkey, they can be members of the European Union.
Thank you. Let's take another question.
Thank you. Ramūnas Vilpišauskas, Vilnius University. I have a question to Antonietta. Actually, it's linked to what Andy just asked. My question is about what kind of factors characterize Central Eastern European countries when this window of opportunity opened that you talked about, because now there are many arguments which say that Ukraine might be facing this window of opportunity exactly as Poland or other countries did in early 90s. So it, you know, when people are willing to die on the streets for the future of their country, they will be willing to survive shock therapy reforms and other changes that might be needed. So I would be very interested, how would you more specifically define these factors, and whether you see Ukraine being in a similar situation now? Thank you.
Okay, let's take two more, Philippe and Stefan. Okay.
Yes, well, first, Antonietta, my interpretation of your article is that conditionality is conditional. Conditionality does not work necessarily to the same degree or even in the same direction in different contexts. And it seems to me that the most important difference in the context is that I think that the efficacy of conditionality depends on the pre-existence of something you could call a security community. And it seems to me that's the big difference between the countries you're looking at. And so conditionality then assumes that the units that are being conditioned are somehow relatively secure, either in terms of domestic, this is to say, they're not in a civil war, or they're not in the immediate aftermath of a civil war, or they do not have serious external threats, so to speak. So that's just I mean, Flavia, your data seems to confirm what is one of the sort of standard observations about Europeanization, that is, increase in executive. But there's something terribly paradoxical about that, especially if you sort of look at the substance of the recent European parliamentary elections, where one of the main accusations is that national executives are losing autonomy. So they may have gained autonomy, so to speak, domestically, but the price for gaining autonomy domestically is to lose a great deal of autonomy. And of course that becomes even more critical the more the EU begins to look like a German empire, right? So it's not just you lose autonomy to this faceless thing called the European Union, but the European Union is not as faceless as it used to be, and it looks as if you're some kind of an agent of Angela Merkel. I mean, this is Beppe Grillo here, right? So maybe I'm influenced especially by that. Finally, just a very unfair comment to Jan-Henrik. One of the most important themes in the recent literature on democratization is the professionalization of the role of politician, not civil servant. Now, I realize that's not what your research is all about, but do you have any thoughts about, I don't know whether this comes up in the interstices of what you're doing or whether, you know, but this general theme that one of the most persistent trends, and this is not just new, this is new and old democracies, is the increasing professionalization of the role of politicians. Right? So,
My name is Stefan Auer. I'm at the University of Hong Kong, and I would like to thank Antonietta for raising the issue of Ukraine. That's a bold move. I want to expand on it in my presentation in the afternoon. But isn't the puzzle actually far less puzzling? As Philip Schmitter just said, conditionality is conditional. And could we not simply say that the EU has worked well when it had the real, offered real prospect of enlargement, right? So the enlargement policy was successful. But when that was not a real prospect, either because the country didn't desire membership like Russia, or the country was too large, too awkward, too backward like Ukraine, then the power of EU was rather limited. So in other words, enlargement worked very well, but the European neighborhood policy resulted in shambles, in a shambles, right? And therefore, it's not all that puzzling. And I would even say the initial idea that we needed both deepening and widening, right? That was the agenda after '89, has been proven false. That if we embarked on a project of a wider Europe at the expense of further deepening, then Europe today may well have been in the position to integrate even countries like Ukraine. But we all know that that's not a realistic prospect, and therefore EU's power in Ukraine is depressingly low, and EU's power in relation to Russia is depressingly low. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Adrian, and thank you all for the very interesting and relevant questions. To Andy's question, what is also to the second question, what kind of factors am I talking about? I'm looking especially below the state level. So I fully agree with you that there is a set of structural factors, starting with geography, obviously, if that's what you meant, and also size, which are very relevant. But even if we assume that, what we thought from the basis of the countries that we looked at in Central and Eastern Europe is that conditionality worked approximately as well in Bulgaria as it worked in Slovakia, as it worked in Poland, as it worked in the Czech Republic. And actually, Czech Republic is an outlier on civil service reform, but as Jan Meyer said, this is a very long story. But if we have similarly sized countries that are suited to join the EU, and the EU offered the enlargement prospect in the same way, that worked approximately the same way. So that was, my initial start was there, and then the question comes to the point of Stephen immediately. Okay, so if the EU offers the same amount, the same perspective to Ukraine tomorrow, as it has in the Western Balkans, let's take Macedonia, which is not so structurally different from Bulgaria, how come then, so I'm trying to make here the relevant small comparison. So I fully agree, Turkey here is not a player, but how come then conditionality is conditional in Macedonia and not in Bulgaria? I mean, we're talking about neighbors, we're talking about similar sizes, we're talking about many similarities, so we don't have huge socioeconomic differences and so on and so forth. So I'm looking at this, and this is where I'm suggesting that the point of time where this happened created a couple of variables which have to do with domestic institutional structure, including the informal actors and how this emerges and plays as actual ways in which these democracies or regimes function, and with the socialization of the actors. And when I say socialization, I didn't have very much time to expound on prior socialization. I don't mean necessarily socialization, as Jan Meyer talks about, by the EU, but I'm talking about the crucial narratives that were created by the leaders of the transition in all of the Central and Eastern European countries, which said, our place is the EU, and there is no other game possible. There was nothing else. In the 90s, there was no other ideological alternative. If we look now at Russia, what Russia is doing in the Ukraine, and that's partially an answer to your question, Stephen, Russia is saying there is another game possible, there's another alternative, there is a community, there's a Slavicness, there's the Eastern Orthodoxy. So discourses at the discursive level are important because this is what political elites worked with to legitimize themselves, and that's going to the security community. I fully agree with Philip. Obviously, this is also but my main point is institutions and informal institutions, and I'm going to not take very long on this, but I want to stress this. By informal institutions, I mean the structures and rules whereby certain actors use these new democracies or these new regimes for their own end. If you have a neo-patrimonial political system as Ukraine is emerging, whatever the EU does, and I did a very micro study of company law, related a little bit to Laszlo's work, of company law in Ukraine. And if you go down to the actual votes of parliament in Ukraine, when it comes to the crunch, they don't accept EU rules because they see it will limit their room of maneuver and it will make these companies more transparent and more competitive. So I don't know about 5 or 10 years ago, but once a country is in a system which is so much transformed, I mean, it's not that Bulgaria doesn't have oligarchs, it's not that the Czech Republic doesn't have tunneling, but what it is that in the 1990s, these countries had institutional systems which are open to interacting with the EU, and they were ready to take the institutional model from the EU. Not only the conditionality, but also the idea of what a democracy is. Now we are much more problematic, and that's my answer on Ukraine, that it's going to be much more problematic because there is different views of what the Ukrainian political system should be.
I guess I can address both questions, or more the comment from Philip Schmieder. So what I do is basically looking domestically at the composition of policy networks, right? So you are right, indeed, executives are the ones that negotiate with the EU and therefore have control over the agenda. But this doesn't mean that domestically other actors would be precluded from the decision-making process, right? So, and the network analysis that I conduct allows me to actually identify all the actors, state actors, executives, administrative bodies involved in decision-making on the one hand, and at the same time political parties and other non-state actors that would have an impact. So if you look at the parliamentary phase, the work in the committee, so the role of the political parties, there are also influences from other interest groups. So Europeanization as such would not preclude their participation, right? And what I do with network analysis is to test the literature on the empowerment of the executives and to look at the power configuration among state actors and non-state actors.
Thank you, Philippe. Appreciate the question. It's not unfair, maybe a bit difficult. But I think the professionalization of politicians, first of all, I think one would need to distinguish between the meaning of professionalization for a civil servant and for a politician. For the civil servants, we talk about civil service laws, merit recruitment, etc. But for politicians, therefore, we're talking about something else. But this does not mean that we cannot study professionalization there. There are lots of reasons probably to do it, because there's an opportunity to look at careers, the closure of careers. There's lots of research on career patterns in for instance, among ministers by now. The research on regulation of political parties, not just party funding, but parties more generally, and the whole research on cartel parties, I think, corresponds quite nicely to your question about the professionalization of politicization, because you could say that it's then about the micro foundations of the cartel party thesis, in a way. And we could even look at the Europeanization area there by saying whether, those who have served for some time in Strasbourg, change a little bit their views on what their role is as politicians. Just an idea.
Yes, thank you. I first have I also have a couple of questions for Antoinetta. I mean, I see your analysis, but I don't see quite yet what it means for the theoretical conclusions, because as has been mentioned a couple of times, conditionality is conditional, and if in those countries that have not become members, the conditions are systematically worse than in those that have become members, it tells us something about the limitations of conditionality, but it doesn't tell us anything about the limitations of the theory. And I think some of the cases you mentioned are clearly over-determined in terms of the theory. I mean, you have bad domestic conditions, but you also have non-credible promises, like in the case of Ukraine. Even Macedonia, I mean, because of Greece, does not really have a credible promise, and that weakens the impact of the European Union. Otherwise, I think we also have to be careful not to glorify what has happened in the earlier period. I mean, if you look at cases like Slovakia, Serbia, it needed game-changing elections for conditionality to work. So I think we have to be careful not to just remain at the country level, but also have to look at how power configurations change in these countries during this period. We also have to take in mind that it really took until the last minute for Latvia to somehow adopt the minority protection rules that the EU wanted. So, I mean, some care in distinguishing these cases, and also looking at, let's say, the regime's power considerations in resisting change as long as possible should also be taken into account.
Conditionality, and this conditionality, what about this conditionality in the post-accession period? Because we have seen a number of examples, and I wouldn't like to mention the countries, there are several, which complied with the very strong pre-accession conditionalities, otherwise they would not have been able to join. But once they joined, they practically ignored, some of them even violated some of these conditionalities. With this kind of behavior, they would not have been able to join. What can the European Union do to strengthen or implement the same conditionalities in the post-accession period? Because it is not only important for the internal structure of the European Union, it is very important because the EU considers itself as an anchor of democracy for third countries. In fact, very personally, if I were Lukashenko and Mr. Barroso visited me, teaching me the main values of democracy, etc., I'm sorry, very politely, I would send him back to Brussels and say, first of all, please do your job within the European Union, and then you are most welcome to come back and we can discuss these issues. So it is definitely undermining the European Union's reliability and confidence as a major anchor of for third countries. The second issue is the silent professional socialization of public officials. I fully agree, this is very important, but what happens if for changing power political relations, power politics relations, this process, this continuing process over 2 decades will be interrupted, to some extent even eliminated. And the key task in that case will not to work together or continuing working together with Brussels, but to criticize, to challenge, and even to blame Brussels. In this way, you can also create some kind of professionalization. But what are the consequences? And it is on the way.
Thanks. Josef Batra from Comenius University in Bratislava. I have a question for Jan Hendrik about which was a very interesting research. I'm going to ask you why I got so many replies from the Slovaks, which was quite interesting. But the question really is about the explanatory factor of European integration and EU administration, participation in EU administration as an explanatory factor. Now, obviously, you make a connection between professionalization and participation in EU affairs. Now, I wonder what would happen if you replicated that research in Norway or Switzerland, right? What would be the what would be the results there if you sent out the same kind of questionnaire to Oslo and you build on some of the theories of our friends in Arena? You didn't mention Jarle Trondal, you might have, but anyway, I mean, what would happen there? Isn't it just a question of professionalization, and you work for the OECD? I mean, isn't it just a question of professional standards being working on an international agenda? If you look at Singapore, it has nothing to do with European integration, and yet their public administration is wonderfully professional, and but it's not related to EU integration. So, and the second thing, if you think about UK when they entered the EU, you have some of the literature argues that, for instance, the external services of the European Union was professionalized by the influx of UK officials since the 1970s. Dimier and McGeever and their JCMS article on the external services, they really argue that. So I'm wondering if you should be rethinking the processes from a kind of a multi-perspective of professionalization. And then that's the footnote about the Slovaks. You got more than 740 responses from the Slovaks out of 2,600, which is about 1/5. I'm, more than 1/5, and we in Slovakia are kind of hoping that our public administration is, very pro-European, very active, as opposed to our public, which is not, right? We have seen that in the recent EP election, which was, the lowest turnout, 13%. So I wonder what was the reason for getting so many responses? Did you get local help from colleagues there, or what was it? Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm Milada Vachudova from UNC Chapel Hill, and it's lovely to be here. Thank you so much. I just have a question to Antoinette, and I think I'm just going to agree with Frank here and say, I think you can, when you compare enlargement to Central and Eastern Europe to the Western Balkans, you can see it as quite different, but I tend to see it more as a continuation of the same processes, right? That there was a lot of variation in how EU enlargement impacted the Central and East European new members, and that variation is mostly explained by domestic politics. Very little of it is explained by different treatment by the EU. I think that was one of the benefits of studying the European enlargement process, that the treatment by the Commission was quite unimaginative and quite similar across the cases. And in the Western Balkans, I also see that same kind of variation, but again, I point to domestic politics primarily. And, I'd be much stronger than Frank about Macedonia. I think that the Greek veto obliterates conditionality in Macedonia. I'm just between Belgrade and Skopje right now, and the downward spiral in Skopje, of course, there's a lot of people to blame for it, but the absence of moving forward, I think, has had a profound impact. And in Bosnia, of course, Dayton. But if you look at Croatia, then Serbia, then Montenegro, what you see is that that impact of the EU accession process on political party agendas, which is kind of the step before policy that I've been looking at for the last 5-6 years especially, the impact on political party agendas in Croatia and now in Serbia is amazing, right? And that transformation of the Serbian party system has now allowed for addressing things like Kosovo and other sovereignty and territory issues, and then also individual rights and freedoms, LGBT and other things.
Is the time dimension of using getting the institutions right and getting the economic incentives right, because the time point was a different one. If you look at the two paraphrases, to what extent does that play a role in your analysis? So I think we have to come to a close now, but each of the panel members, of course, have an opportunity to make a final statement. We start with Flavia.
I think, I mean, if it would be to draw a conclusion from my presentation and from my colleagues here in the panel, I think we see different effects domestically among the CE countries, and we see signs from my own work of a sort of a deparliamentarization until now, but we also see signs or positive effects, as we've heard, in terms of the EU effect on public administration and on actually on socializing public officials and becoming more efficient in what they do. So even if we see this strong bureaucratization, it can also have positive effects in terms of the efficiency of the decision-making process as such.
Thank you. I think it's a very good question. What does it mean for the theory, from Frank and Milada? And I think it does not obliterate the theory, but I think to me it points to a couple of things which we need to pay more careful attention to upgrade the theory. That's my view. I think what's the most important thing here, I agree with Milada, there's variation. There was variation in Central and Eastern Europe. There is variation now in the Western Balkans. And I also agree with you that the cases are overdetermined. But they were also overdetermined in the time when we studied Central and Eastern European cases. And this continues to be a problem. So I think what it is, what I see, the continuation of this and the proof that I'm looking for is to take a couple of cases where only the one variable is different and then take it from there. The one thing which I think matters, the way we looked at the theory, we formulated it, is we said, external incentives are responded to by domestic actors based on domestic costs and benefits. And what I'm interested in is to explore what domestic costs and benefits we're talking about in terms of the political process and in terms of the place of domestic actors in this political process. My work has been on what happens with informal actors who have captured the state when they're faced with EU demands. What happens not with political parties, but with administrations in the pre-policy making stage when they're captured by informal networks. So how does state capture meet EU demands? What kind of informal institutions are relevant then? Because in the policy process, we have a number of actors whose room for maneuver gets limited by EU conditionality. And this is very much relevant to Ukraine. It's also relevant, I think, to post-accession countries, a number of countries, not only Hungary, but also Bulgaria, Romania, and so on.
Yeah, thank you for the questions. Again, difficult. Let me start, Josef, right? Let me start with your questions. Norway and Switzerland. I don't think we would find the same effect. First of all, there are different starting points. And the region that we looked at is a region that is in that respect relatively homogeneous in terms of starting point and is lower in terms of its level of meritocratization that it started off with. There's also a question of traditions, and this refers already a bit to your second question. how important is the EU actually? I mean, we don't want to say that the EU is extremely important. I mean, the effect that we find is fairly small. We rather say that it makes a contribution, it makes a positive contribution. If we had not found an effect, we would have had another negative conclusion. So maybe a small one, but it's clearly that domestic factors are probably extremely important, and there are a few people in the room who work on those domestic issues. And I think one might want to raise the issue of administrative traditions, which for Western Europe are far more important, and their impact on reproducing a legacy is much, much greater. The reproductive capacity of those traditions is greater because there have been fewer regime changes, there has been much less flux in the West. While the argument that I make and some other colleagues is that for the new member states, for Central and Eastern Europe, the actual reproductive capacity of the legacy is much, much more limited. And therefore, I think the potential impact of the EU is probably greater there compared to Norway, Switzerland, and others. About the UK, that's probably a very interesting topic to research in the future. And about Slovakia, I think we'll keep this for the break. Just conducting a survey in the administration in new member states and also in Western Balkan states is a very amazing exercise in understanding the capacity of different administrations and who coordinates with whom and who doesn't, and whom do you need to ask before finally something is sent out. So that was a case study in itself, I would say. Yeah. I'll come back in the break.
Just very briefly, the difference between timing was not very much because the economic state capacities in the South came on the agenda the second half of the 80s. But the major difference, there were two major differences between the East and the South. In the South, they were already member states, and the latitudes of the Commission were limited to enter in directly in domestic institutional change, whereas the Easterners were outside and the EU couldn't ask anything. So the passive and active leverage, as Milad would say, was enormous. But by the mid-90s, the EU also learns that even all this passive and active leverage in itself will not work if there is no direct participation in institution building. So there's a learning also by the second half of the 90s that the EU has to enter into this, which actually, surprisingly to me, none of these lessons went over to the South.
Thank you very much for all the presentations, for the discussion, and the comments and questions you got. So we break now for coffee.